Before I begin, can I just pick up on what happened yesterday when we heard from the intermediaries? At the end of proceedings, a couple of people approached counsel to the inquiry and asked if they could take advantage of the intermediary process. They wondered if it had been too late. Well, it isn't too late. We offer to anyone who wants it, whether they're in this room now or whether they are listening remotely, the services of the intermediaries. All they have to do is to contact the inquiry and ask to be put in touch with the intermediaries, and then the intermediaries will in due course produce a supplementary report covering anyone who wants to take advantage of their services. You've seen how it's presented and how they deal with it and who they are, and it will be the same people who will be presenting the supplementary report. As for today, can I welcome Professor Christie to the panel? We have to swear you in, so let that be done, please.
Please state your full name.
Deborah Christie.
And repeat after me. I do solemnly, sincerely.
I do solemnly, sincerely.
And truly declare and affirm.
And truly declare and affirm.
That the evidence I shall give.
That the evidence I shall give.
Shall be the truth.
Shall be the truth.
The whole truth.
The whole truth.
And nothing but the truth.
And nothing but the truth.
I'm going to pick up where we left off yesterday, looking at the psychological and emotional impacts on family members, spouses, partners, children, parents, etc. Some of the emotional responses that a partner or other family member may experience will be the same or very similar to those which would be experienced by the person who is themselves ill. Is that fair?
Yeah. Look, I don't know whether, Deborah, is that a good opportunity for you to talk a bit about experience of illness in families? Yeah.
Yes, I think that when an illness comes into a family, it's not just the individual that's affected. The young person, the adult, whoever it is that's given the diagnosis, lives in a system, a complicated and complex system, and everybody in that family is equally affected by varying degrees of emotional response, be it sadness or guilt or distress. But no, it's not one person that carries that load alone.
And in particular, some of the shared emotional responses may be fear, uncertainty. You've alluded to distress, so the distress of watching a loved one in pain, whether it's physical or mental pain. We've heard in particular from witnesses who had family members, often partners, receiving interferon treatment, interferon ribavirin, of the effect of that on personality and personality change. So coping with the personality change, for example, of one's partner, may be an additional emotional, psychological burden for a family.
Yes, absolutely. And it's that contrast, it's that knowing what that person used to be like and then realising that they're different and feeling angry about it or distressed by it, but equally by the fact that it's not that individual's fault, that it's something external that's happened to cause this, and whether it's possible for people to be able to blame the illness, if you like, rather than blame the person. So, and that can be very, very difficult because you're faced with somebody who's perhaps short-tempered or grumpy or distant or withdrawn, and what you want to do is you want to be with them and take care of them, and they're rejecting you or pushing you away, and so then you get an additional layer of difficulty, if you like, that adds to the difficult situation.
If I could add to that,
yes.
Just to say that I think the lack of information around how the interferon-based medicines are going to impact on the individual is also another factor. So I think the partners and the supporting people were having to discover as they go along that this change in personality and character is attributable to the medicine and not just to a difficult personality. And I think that's been come quite strongly through some of the transcripts, that they're having to find this out as they go along because they weren't given that information up front, or very limited information about this was presented.
Well, if I actually just say a little bit more about this, because I think the way you phrased the question was this sort of shared response, people responding in a similar way, and we certainly heard that some families had this very solid response. They pulled together, they coped. But we also did read, and I know from other work I've done, where there were really important discrepancies between family members. And if you remember what I was talking about at the beginning of yesterday, I talked about the way people make sense of illness. And certainly there's quite a lot of work around now looking at what we call dyads, say a parent and a child or partners or whatever, where one has a particular way of thinking about the illness and coping with the illness, and it's not matched in the other person. And that where you get those rifts, it can be really distressing, where maybe the person who is affected rather than infected in some way perhaps blames the other for not coping in a certain way. And some of those rifts that you can see because of the different ways of processing and thinking about the illness can be very powerful and actually very hurtful, because you don't get the power of the support within the family and that cohesion, which we've seen can work so well, but it also can break down pretty. And we certainly read a number and heard a number of witnesses talk about that they just couldn't take it anymore. They felt the other person somehow wasn't involved, might have been within a couple and so on. So I think we need to remember that it's not always a good group response in that way from a family perspective.
And one of the additional burdens potentially for family members will be additional caring responsibilities, either directly for the person who's infected or having to take on additional caring responsibilities, for example, for children because their partner is not able to do that. What kind of toll can that take in practical, emotional, psychological terms, both on individuals and on families as a whole?
It can have a significant impact psychologically. So it can have an impact on your identity. So if you imagine if you've got a job that you love and you enjoy, and you have to give that job up to look after somebody that you love and want to care for, there's still that dilemma of having to give that job up and what that means for who you identify as. Because a lot of us see ourselves as the job. The job that we do is how we describe ourselves when we introduce ourselves to people, and that can get lost. There can be enormous financial implications, obviously, if somebody has to stop working. We see this a lot in families where there's chronic illness, where one of somebody in the family has to give up a job, so there's a financial impact. And socially, if you think about most people who have jobs have relationships within their workplace. They have friends that they go for a drink with afterwards, or they have the Christmas party, and that might seem really minor, but actually it's a big thing because you've lost that whole social circle, and your life becomes condensed and focused on just into that very small sort of family unit. So and there can be resentment as well. So there's all these complicated feelings that need to be thought about and processed and understood and spoken about. And as Professor Weinman said, you very often find it difficult to talk about it because you want to protect somebody. You don't want them to know that you're resentful. You don't want them to know that you're sad that you've given up your job, or angry, or you don't want people to know that you haven't got money to do things. So there's also that sort of closing down on communication, which has an impact on family relationships.
And we talked yesterday about the process of adjustment for the person who is unwell and the impact upon the concept of self-identity for the person who is unwell. But what you're describing is those same two processes or ideas impacting as well upon family members.
Absolutely, because as we grow throughout our lives, we go through various developmental phases, and becoming a parent, becoming a partnership, becoming a grandparent, all those different developmental phases comes with sort of certain expectations, our own expectations from our families, from society, from films, from everything that we read about what it means to be a good grandparent or to be a good mother or a good wife or husband. And that identity then gets disrupted by the introduction of an illness, and particularly by an illness that is potentially life-limiting. It kind of just cuts you off at the knees and can throw you under the bus. And if you've got a good support system, then you can be amazingly resilient, and you can pull together, as John said. And many people do that. Many people do that in an amazing way, an inspiring way. But equally, it's very, very difficult.
There are two pieces of literature I just want to refer you to. They're materials you've referenced in the report, which provide confirmation of what you're saying. Henry, could we have EXPG 00000022, please? And it should come up on the screen in front of you.
You remember that? Oh, yeah, which one was that?
It's a paper called by Golix and others, 2013, and it's called The Impact of Patients' Chronic Disease on Family Quality of Life and Experience from 26 Specialties. And then we can see from the abstract methods, it talks about semi-structured interviews being carried out with 133 family members of mostly chronically ill patients from 26 medical specialities. Family members invited to discuss all areas of their lives that have been affected by having an unwell relative. And then if we look just over halfway down that page, please, Henry, at conclusion, we can see it says, this large-scale multi-speciality study has demonstrated the significant yet similar impact that illness can have on the quality of life of patients' family members. Family quality of life is a previously neglected area of healthcare which needs to be addressed in order to provide appropriate support for the patient and family unit. And then there are just a couple of references within the paper I wanted to show you and then ask you to comment on. On the same page under the heading background, we can see it said there, the quality of life of family members as well as of patients can be hugely reduced in terms of physical effects, psychological distress and social problems. And then the last sentence of that paragraph, previous work has shown that family members of patients can be more emotionally affected by illness than patients themselves. And then if we turn, please, Henry, to, it should be the fourth page. It's headed page, it's page 790 in the article itself. That's the one, towards the bottom of that page, please, or the bottom half of that page. Thank you. So we see there, under the heading emotional impact, it records 92% of the family members interviewed were affected emotionally by the patient's illness, mentioning worry, 35%, frustration, 27%, anger, 15%, and guilt, 14%. Worry was reported when family members were thinking about the future or the patient's death. Less common psychological effects included feeling upset, annoyed, helpless, stressed, and lonely. And then it's reference to forms of support, some people finding it difficult to find someone to talk to, and this resulting in them bottling up their feelings, finding it very difficult to cope, with many describing breaking down in tears when alone. And then if we just go, so the study then looks at a number of different impacts, daily activities, family relationships, the family member's own health, work and financial impacts. But we'll pick it up, please, should be page 8, Henry, in the discussion towards the end of the article. So we can see there the impact of a patient's illness on families is widespread and profound. Family members are affected in multiple ways across all medical specialities. This study has identified the major ways in which family lives can be affected by disease and the commonality of issues across all diseases. And then, Henry, if we can go down the left-hand column on that page to the second paragraph, thank you. If you could highlight the paragraph beginning family members, thank you. Family members of patients from all specialities felt a great emotional impact, the most previously reported topic. They often felt they had to hide their feelings from the patient in order to provide support. For many, this was very difficult. This emotional impact has a major influence on many areas of their life, e.g. on health and sleep. Family members of patients can be more emotionally affected than the patients themselves, particularly in the area of oncology. This may be because attention is mainly focused on the patient and much consideration given to the patient's needs. In contrast, the family member and their concerns are usually ignored or not understood. And then if we just look at the right-hand column on that page, this is the last reference. Second paragraph down, please, Henry. A little higher up, thank you, beginning the impact on family finances. The impacts on family finances and employment were major issues. Family members described the financial impact of having to reduce or give up work as a result of the patient's illness, often compounded by the patient also giving up work. Looking after an unwell patient is expensive. And then the next paragraph, please, Henry, just the first 3 lines of that. Family members described their own existing medical conditions worsening. Several developed depression. This study identifies family members as a hidden patient group with an apparent ripple effect of illness. One patient being unwell has the potential to create several more patients in the family. This can then magnify problems with finances and family relationships in a vicious cycle. This hidden burden has a potentially huge financial impact on the healthcare system that could potentially be reduced by appropriate family support. Any observations or comments about those findings?
Well, I think they fit exactly really with what we're saying. This is, part of the very strong evidence that we've drawn on. There's a huge literature on the stress of caregiving generally, whether it's with a very sick child or an elderly parent, and that literature shows really strongly that you not only see psychological changes, you see physical changes in immune function. There are even studies looking at how quickly, if people have wounds, if they're caregivers, those wounds are slower to heal because the immune system's compromised, because of that really long, chronic stress that's not going away. It's pretty uncontrollable in that way. It's something that's always going to be there. So I think, these sorts of findings really underline how much of a burden it can be. But again, as we said yesterday, for some people, it's a powerful and important thing to do. And that the roles they take on as caregivers become really important to them, and become part of that new self, that new identity. So, although it's pretty bleak, pretty negative, there is that other side that we shouldn't forget.
Yes.
Just to say that, of course, this study also was done in 26 specialities, and none of those specialities are ones where people hide their diagnosis. And I think that makes an additional, very profound difference, because this is a distressing report, and it shows how awful it can be for people physically and emotionally. But these people generally will be people who can share the stories and what they're going through with their friends and their neighbours and their healthcare workers. And I think when you take that part away, it has an even greater impact on the conclusions that this report have made.
And that's picked up in the second piece of literature I wanted to just ask you to look at, which is a World Health Organization analysis of the impact of HIV on families. Henry, that's EXPG 5039, please. So this is a 2005 paper by the World Health Organization entitled "What is the Impact of HIV on Families?" Again, referenced in your report. If we could go, please, Henry, to page 4. Under the heading Findings, if we could just highlight the first paragraph, please, and picks up on one of the very points that Ms. Edwards has made. Human immunodeficiency virus has a large psychological, physical and social impact on infected individuals and their families. Stigmatisation worsens this impact. It hinders the prevention and treatment of HIV and hampers social support and HIV disclosure. And it's that latter point, I think, that you were emphasising then. And then if we could go on, please, Henry, to it's numbered 8 at the bottom of the page. Yes, it should be page 8 that you have. So if we look under the heading HIV and families, the second paragraph, beginning in the first 15 years of the AIDS epidemic. Could you highlight that, please, Henry? So this records that in the first 15 years of the AIDS epidemic, families had to deal with death and the loss of family members. Since the introduction of HAART in 1996, however, their widespread use has reduced the number of AIDS-related deaths in Australia, Europe and the United States. Now families must deal with HIV infection as a chronic disease to be managed for the lifetime of the infected members. And then if we just go on, please, to the page 10, Henry. There's a passage, psychosocial issues, which echoes much of what was said yesterday. But if we then look at families, the bottom of the page, please, Henry, under the heading families. Talks about the social stigma that surrounds HIV may have adverse repercussions not only for the individual but also for their family. HIV has an impact on partners and on the dyadic relationship. Caregiving is associated with stress and AIDS-related stigma. And then if we go over the page, please, to page 11, we see in the second paragraph, please, Henry, beginning with children, we see a discussion there of the emotional distress that children may experience due to the HIV infection of a parent. And then if we go on, please, to page 12, Henry, under the heading, the impact of disclosure on the family, halfway down the page. And we pick it up in the second paragraph. A review of the evidence in the early 1990s showed that when people disclosed their HIV status, family members experienced a range of emotions, including feelings of helplessness, fear of the loved one dying, concern about care, and fear of becoming infected. A recent qualitative study with mainly European participants showed that even in the post-HAART era disclosure of an even in the post-HAART era, disclosure of an HIV infection may have an emotional impact on family members. They may be surprised and saddened by the disclosure. The potential for terminal illness, as well as the impact of medical treatments and constant adjustment of hopes and fears, can affect both the individuals infected with HIV and their families. I think that's all we probably need to look at from that paper. But again, perhaps invite you, Ms. Edwards, to comment upon what we see set out there.
Or maybe one of the others whose social
Well, I think it
wrote in the report.
It brings out very clearly that the impact extends beyond the individual to the family. And in terms of stigma, the family is often also stigmatised. They have an associative stigma by their close association. So they share very much in the whole stigmatisation process, as well as in these other social impacts. And originally, the emphasis was very much on just the patient. But I think that a lot of the recent work is very much emphasising the family unit and the importance of taking that through in terms of interventions.
And we'll come back certainly in more detail to the question of stigma and discrimination and disclosure. Just turning back to your report at page 4, you've said this towards the top of the page. The dominant picture, this was the picture that you picked up from the materials you read, is one of a wide range of negative psychological impacts, often with devastating effects on day-to-day functioning and quality of life. These impacts occurred in the context of so many negative social effects arising from the relentless health problems and treatment side effects, together with the distressing levels of stigma that were experienced. That, I think, was the overall picture you derived from the statements and transcripts and oral evidence you saw.
Yeah, I mean, I think...
I'm sorry. I didn't mean to interrupt, but please go ahead. I have a question, because it seems to me we're turning away from the two papers that you've just been looking at. And it had struck me in what the Gollick's paper says, that it is focusing upon the families. It's not focusing immediately upon the patient. One understands why that is. But is the position, perhaps, can it be summarised in this way, that proper care of the patient involves care for the family and support systems.
Yes,
Yes.
absolutely.
Very definitely.
Yes. Oh, sorry. We all said yes.
Universal agreement.
Yes, yes, yes. Collective, yes.
That's what I wanted to ask.
So,
Thank you very much.
thank you. So yes, I was just drawing your attention to how you'd summarised, from your professional perspective, your understanding of what you'd read.
Yeah, I mean, I think I wrote that statement, and I think it, but I also think that just before that, I had identified the possibility that people could draw some benefits.
Yes.
It wasn't all bad news, and I certainly spoke to one or two people yesterday for whom there had been growth, personal growth, and so on. But the dominant picture, certainly from all the witness statements and from the literature, is one of a whole range of problems compounded by treatments failing, further conditions happening, and so on and so on. And by a lot of the other things we're going to talk about in a minute.
Yes.
By some of the communication issues.
Yes, absolutely. We're going to
Yeah.
come on to all of those. Can I ask, before we leave the topic or the theme of psychological impact, I wanted to ask Professor Christie about some of the particular issues that may arise in relation to children and adolescents, because we know a significant numbers of children or adolescents were infected, in particular with HIV, but with HIV and hepatitis. First of all, can I ask you just to talk a little about the impact of long-term illness, and in particular a long-term illness and serious illness of the kind we're dealing with on children and adolescents?
Yes, so I would break it into two groups, which the first one is children. So children who are being very much cared for and looked after, and are often very protected by their parents, so may not be aware of the diagnosis or the full implications of the diagnosis, or may not understand fully the long-term implications just by virtue of their level of intellectual, cognitive level of skill and ability. However, what children are aware of is the fact that they are limited, that they are prevented from doing things. So they will not be able to do sleepovers. Now, sometimes that can be because their mum and dad might worry about them being away from home, or it might be because the other children's parents don't understand what's needed or required in order to take proper care, and so they'll not invite them. Children with chronic illness often don't get invited to parties, birthday parties, because the parents feel that they can't be catered for properly. They might not be allowed to go on school trips. So all of these things that we think of as being really part of our childhood and part of growing up, of just having fun, because that's your primary job when you're a kid, a little one. Your main job is just to have fun and be looked after. And having a diagnosis of any illness, but particularly one which is potentially life-limiting, is going to stop you being able to do that in the way that your friends are able to do. The second group is adolescents, which is a really different group, and it's in some ways it's the best group, and in some ways it's the most difficult, because adolescents are going themselves, without any illness involved, are going through such tremendous change. Their brains are developing rapidly and changing dramatically, developing decision-making parts of the brain, developing the parts of the brain that allow you to think about your future. And the main job of an adolescent is to decide who I am, who I want to be, and who I want to be with. And those three questions are what most adolescents spend their adolescence doing, working that out, deciding what they want to go to university and study, deciding what kind of job they want to have, looking at other people, identifying role models. They spend a lot of their adolescence deciding on their sexuality, on their gender, who it is they want to spend the rest of their life with. They spend a lot of their time completely ignoring their parents. All of us have done this. We all spend, that's one of our main jobs, is just to ignore your parents and and borrow money from them so that you can, you know, because and it's a dilemma, and it is kind of funny, but it's also so true, and what happens in an adolescent's life when an illness comes along, completely uninvited, is that it knocks you off track. It starts to get you to question, can I be who I'd like to be? Am I ever going to be able to have a long-term relationship? And that came out through a lot of the transcripts. It came out really strongly that young people, and I'm thinking of adolescence as going, if you look at the brain literature right up to the age of 25, 26, 29 even, that a young person's brain isn't fully developed until 29. And that you actually spend so much time trying to work out who you want to be that the illness completely stops you being able to think about that in a coherent kind of way. And it can cause you to withdraw. It can cause you to rely so much on your parents that actually you stop that whole developmental process of becoming independent and moving away. So it's really devastating, an illness, and as we all keep adding as a caveat that there are many young people who grow through adversity, and grow through adversity is a really important psychological idea. But even with that growth through adversity, there is still an enormous impact on the decisions that young people can and are able to make when they're faced with living with this. And it's not just them, it's this ripple effect that we've already talked about, because it affects them and it affects their relationships with their friends. And again, friends are so important when you're an adolescent. They matter so much to you, more than your friendship with your parents. And your friends will not want to be with you. They will not want to spend time with you. You will be seen as different. And all of that's going to affect your ability to develop and grow yourself, your picture of who you're going to be.
Some of those from whom we heard very, very eloquent and powerful testimony, who had been diagnosed with HIV as either children or adolescents, had grown up with it effectively all their life, and one of the points they made was they had never known anything different. Yep. So in terms of self-identity, their self-identity was to a very considerable extent almost entirely shaped by the illness.
Yes, and if you think about that, then your initial identity as a core human being is not one where illness is involved. And when illness then becomes your identity, it limits you. It can limit you. It doesn't always, but it can limit you. It stops you striving. It can stop you reaching out for things. It can stop you trying to find things that you may have done. It may affect your ability to do something like a gap year. You may, gap year is not for me because I've got this illness that requires constant medical care. So it can have that effect on you as well. So it kind of limits and changes your perspective of what your potential is. And all of us should have this. All of us should have the potential to be as wide-ranging as possible. But living and growing up with an illness like HIV, which has stigma and all of the negative aspects of that attached to it, that's going to completely restrict and give you a much, much narrower focus on what's possible in life.
As may also some of the practical consequences of the condition in terms of ability to access or complete education.
Oh, absolutely. So we've known right back 30 years ago, I remember going on a trip to Washington, D.C., where they were just starting to look at the cognitive effects of HIV in children. And they were just starting to do the very early brain studies and measuring intellectual ability and the impact on attention and concentration and brain function. And very early on, people started to realise that something like HIV has an impact on the developing brain. And as I've said, if you think about the brain as an organic developing process, as something which grows and prunes and develops based on experience, if you have an illness like HIV, or the treatment associated, and it's not just the disease itself, the condition itself, it's the treatment, the medicines. They affect the brain neurons. They affect the way the brain connects. They affect the way the brain develops. And so you might have had aspirations to do something or be something that would require a certain amount of capacity, and the illness will potentially take some of that capacity away.
You've alluded also in the report to particular difficulties for adolescents with treatment adherence. Can I ask you to comment upon that?
Yes, and again, this is something which is kind of part of being an adolescent, which is to defy authority and to not quite believe what your doctors say. So when you go to your doctor as an adolescent and your doctor say you need to take this medicine because it will keep you well, as an adolescent, there's a kind of a bit of you that thinks, well, yeah, you would say that because you're a doctor, but I'm different. And adolescents have a sense of being bulletproof, that kind of sense of central ego, the kind of like, nothing can touch me, nothing can harm me. It'll happen to other people, but it won't happen to me. And that's a really important part of being an adolescent, because that's what helps you take risks. It allows you to do things like experiment, to go out and just club until 4 o'clock in the morning, or do all the fun things that adolescents get to do before they have to grow up and become an adult. And actually what happens when you are when you're trying to do all of that with a chronic illness, it's going to stop you doing it. It's going to have an impact on you.
And then can I ask you about the position for children? Growing up with a parent who is significantly incapacitated by HIV or hepatitis, and who may themselves be carrying a significant psychological burden of their own. You've referred in the report to a paper, I won't put it on the screen, it's a paper I think by Beardsley, which talks about how the children of effectively ill parents are at significantly greater risk of developing psychiatric disorders themselves.
Yes.
And we've certainly had evidence which supports that.
Yes, so again, if you think about this, the family unit, so a child depends very much on their parent as a source of emotional care, psychological care, physical care, and financial care, all of those aspects. And when a parent becomes ill, understandably and reasonably, they may struggle to provide all of those aspects of care. And may not be emotionally available because of their own mental health problems. There's a lot of evidence in other conditions that where there's no physical illness, where a mother who has emotional distress results in the child developing difficulties. So there's difficulty with attachment, early attachment, which is really, really important for psychological well-being. So the child themselves is affected by the fact that the parent is ill, and will grow up trying to care for their parents even. They'll work very, very hard to look after their mum. And in working so hard to do that, where there's very little support, then and now, very little support for child carers, that child then becomes separated from their peers. Again, they may be well physically, but they can't go to parties because they'd have to leave mum at home on their own, or leave dad at home, and not be sure whether they'd be able to take care of themselves. They might not be able to go to bed at a time that they should be going to bed, because they have to stay up to make sure that mum or dad take their medicine. So there are a lot of knock-on effects on effectively a healthy child living with a parent who is struggling with a chronic life-limiting illness.
And we've heard certainly some evidence of that ripple effect extending into a third generation. Yes. with grandchildren as well.
Yeah, oh, absolutely. Yes, I mean, and it works all the way down depending on the age of grandparents. But again, if you think about the middle age and a teenager, for example, whose grandparents themselves are ill, they may be looking out for their grandparents because their parents were ill. So there's so many possible complications. If a parent is unwell or a parent has died, then the normal burden, if you like, of looking after elderly parents falls on us. As you know, we're in our middle age and we've had our kids, but now our mums and dads aren't well, and so we're looking after them. But if we are taken out of the picture because of something like HIV or hepatitis, then our teenage children or our children in their 20s may then have to step in to look after their grandparents. So it can be multi-generational.
Wanted to explore some of the social impacts, and I appreciate there's no bright line between psychological and social, hence psychosocial, but you've identified in the report, first of all, a range of negative impacts upon an individual's working life, and you've identified that can arise in a number of different ways: inability to work at all, or having to decline promotion, or only being able to work part-time. What can be the impact upon an individual and on a family of those kind of changes having to be made to working life?
Well, a major impact, of course, is financial. And this was a particular problem for families because over time, as the people's condition got worse, they would have to go from full-time employment to part-time employment and then often come out of employment. So that had a major impact. And then in many cases, the carer, the partner, also had to reduce their employment or sometimes give up employment. And so the financial impacts were very great. Of course, it varied a bit according to age. It was particularly important for young couples. And people running small businesses and so on. And of course has impacts all along the line, really, because it's going to affect housing, it's going to affect other opportunities. So a very, very major impact.
We heard from some witnesses who talked also about how not being able to work or not being able to work in the way or in the job that they would have liked impacted upon their self-esteem, their sense of being the person who ought to be the provider and the breadwinner for the family.
Yes, because, work often gives you a sense of identity as well as of other relationships and opportunities. So all these things were very important and come through very strongly. And
the financial impact, and I'll come back to financial impact in a few minutes perhaps, but the financial impact can take a further toll in terms of insecurity, risk of losing house and the like. That threat of financial insecurity will no doubt exacerbate the other social and psychological impacts and negative effects that the personal family may already be experiencing.
Yes, it came through as a major source of worry and tension. And it's obviously going to be tensions within the family and between partners. And this is a very strong effect.
Henry, could we just put up on screen, there's just one passage from your report I wanted to read out, but if we put it up on screen, others can follow it. So the report is EXPG 603, please. And if we go to page 19, please, Henry. It'll probably come up actually as page 20 on yours. It's 19 of the numbered report. If you go on to the next page, please. Thank you. So could you just highlight, please, Henry, the passage halfway down the page beginning the cumulative effects? This is what you've said, and it's up on screen so all can see. The cumulative effects of limitations in employment potential arising from interruptions in education, together with the continuing health effects, have undoubtedly had negative financial consequences for many infected and affected individuals. Although the extent of this varied across individuals and families, depending on their prevailing social circumstances and life stage, the overall costs have been high. A variety of financial payments were available, but they were neither universal nor considered sufficient. Many witnesses described being ground down in their attempts to obtain financial assistance and then giving up. For many, this difficulty in both accessing and receiving financial payments from the trusts and schemes had a range of negative consequences. In addition to the effects of continuing financial hardship, many witnesses report feeling let down, angry, and ultimately helpless. It is known that frequent unsuccessful attempts to change an adverse situation typically result in feelings of helplessness and hopelessness, both of which are likely to lead to negative mood and depression. Is there anything that you would want to add on that issue to what you've recorded powerfully in the report there?
Now, these are very well-known effects from, when people have to, whatever the situation is, when people are in adversity, naturally one tries to cope by gaining control, by doing something. But if you're constantly thwarted in your attempts to gain control or to change a situation, this notion of helplessness, or what we often refer to as learnt helplessness, what you learn is whatever you do, nothing is going to work out, that you actually have no control. We've known for many years that can have a profound effect on people's mood, their well-being, and is a very potent source of depression. That's really, I think we've said that, but these effects are profound across a whole range of domains in life. Yeah.
And you recommended in your report the possibility of obtaining a health economist's input.
Yeah.
I should say that is a matter in which Sir Brian proposes to invite core participants to make submissions as to what issues could or should be addressed by health economists. But could I ask you, from your professional perspective, to identify any particular issues or analyses that you think a health economist might be able to undertake?
Yeah. Okay.
Maybe I could come in here. Certainly there is a concept now that a lot of us are dealing with, known as financial toxicity. We're used to talking about drug and treatment toxicities, but most, even in a good setting, most treatments and people with illnesses experience a financial toxicity. And one of the problems that health economists sort of tend to focus on is direct drug costs or treatment costs to an institution, to the health service. They rarely deal, when NICE, for example, are approving new drugs or treatments, they rarely deal with the financial toxicity that families actually are experiencing as a result of what's happened to them. So I think if you do engage a health economist, which would be good, you really do need one that's rooted well in the more social sort of costs and of all these sorts of areas. The other thing I think that's important to note is that with the sorts of poverty that we saw some families actually, tumble into because of what happened to them, there's no doubt about it that poverty in itself is linked with poor physical outcomes as well. The Marmot report has just been upgraded today, demonstrating how well poverty in itself actually does lead to poorer health outcomes. So even many of the infected and affected individuals that were getting good treatment, if they were plunged into financial toxicity, were likely to experience poorer outcomes physically, not just emotionally.
Can I turn before the break to two other aspects of social impact? The first is the impact upon some of the most intimate aspects of private and family life. And again, you've identified in the report, gleaned from the witness testimony that the inquiry's received, decisions partners having to take of opting for lives of celibacy because of the fear of transmitting infection. And then decisions families having to take, or couples having to take, women facing decisions about terminations, being advised to have terminations, couples deciding not to have children or not to have any more children, or couples having to try and obtain funding and go through processes such as sperm washing or other risk-reduced conception methods. And again, I wondered whether any of you have any observations in particular to make upon those issues and those impacts that you saw.
Well, I mean, they were very obviously central to people, to life, and they caused considerable emotional upset, which lasted throughout their lives, really, because it also affected they wouldn't have grandchildren and the whole issues, and it was in some cases. People had abortions because at the time of conception they didn't even know that their partner had HIV. So, they lacked information, and afterwards they lacked full support, really, in coping with this crisis in their lives.
And I would say that this is a major area of grief and bereavement that hasn't been addressed for many, many people. And I know we're going to talk a little bit more about psychological support, but an important aspect of psychological support would be to focus on the potential, the loss, actual losses, and potential losses. And I think for many people, that's when I looked at the transcript, there's evidence of complicated grief because, how do you come to terms with those difficult losses?
Yes, and I'll come back to complicated grief, certainly. You've already alluded to it and touched on it in your report, but all of these issues you've been discussing can take their toll on marital relationships, partnerships in particular. And you've picked up in your report on some marriages that may have been strengthened, but others that took an irreversible toll on the marriage and marriages ending. Again, is there anything in particular you would want to add to what's in the report in relation to those issues?
One of the things I think actually in this area is that not all relationships anyway start from a good, stable base. And one of the things certainly you notice in any life-threatening illnesses is that it can really be the final straw to already a struggling relationship. Family dynamics are complicated anyway. Relationships between partners are complex as well. And particularly when you get reversals of roles and responsibilities, as we've been talking about this morning, that really can, I think, impinge hugely on an already shaky relationship. And I think we saw some evidence of that in some transcripts.
And families were also often quite isolated. They didn't have the support necessarily of a wider group of relatives or close friends because of all the problems that they were experiencing. So they became very sort of closed units. So I think this put additional stress, and the lack of, as we know, social and psychological support from others is very important.
There's one thing about talking about this within the context of a marriage, but lots of the people who found out that they were hepatitis C and HIV actually just wanted to have sex. It wasn't within necessarily marriage. It was about, as Deborah was saying, about young people who were going off to university and even contemplating a relationship, a physical relationship at all, could be very fearsome. But also just having to negotiate, when do you tell somebody? How are they going to react? Is it even worth going there? Those are huge decision-making processes that without that sort of infectivity, you don't have to make in a relationship normally.
The final question I wanted to ask before we break for the morning break is, again, looking at impact upon family life. Many statements describe, and you've picked this up in the report, the limitations upon the ability of the person who is ill within the family to participate in ordinary family activities, whether it's walking, going on holiday, playing football with the kids, or caring for their children in the way in which they would want to do so. Is that likely to increase or compound a person's sense of guilt or helplessness?
I think that came through very strongly.
Yes.
People were not able to perform the sort of parenting role that they wished to. They were not able to engage in normal family activities, holidays, and other types of things. And I think this was a major concern for both of their, in terms of their own identity and on the effects of the children.
And picking up, I think, on an observation you made, Dr. Thomas, engendering it for some individuals a sense of grief for a family life lost.
Absolutely. And, seeing yourself as an incompetent, I think all of us like to feel in some ways that some roles that we're good at, competent mother, father, whatever. And if you can't manage those roles, it adds tremendously to the distress that you're feeling on top of the additional psychological burden you've got already.
I was just going to say, just to add very briefly, there's a grief for the future, that on being given information that you may understand completely, or maybe not understand completely, but understand that there is going to be a major impact on what you had hoped for, that's deeply traumatic, incredibly traumatic, and can last for years and years and years, even with good support. But that grief for the lost future is really impactful.
Yeah.
So I'm going to move on to another topic, so this may be another suitable opportunity for a break.
Yes, well, I think it would be, and we're spot on, half
Glad
past
to hear
11.
it.
So 12 o'clock.
We do well.
12 o'clock, please.
That's really good. Yes.
One of the most devastating impacts described to this inquiry and captured in your report is the death of a child. And I wanted to ask a little about that and about bereavement and loss more generally. And to do so, first of all, by reference to one of the papers that you've referred to in your report. Henry, it's EXPG 5011, and it's a paper by Christ and others called Bereavement Experiences After the Death of a Child. I just wanted to pick up on a couple of passages and then ask you about them. The introduction, if you could highlight the first 10 lines or so, please, Henry. The death of a child of any age is a profound, difficult and painful experience. While bereavement is stressful whenever it occurs, studies continue to provide evidence that the greatest stress, and often the most enduring one, occurs for parents who experience the death of a child. Individuals and families have many capabilities and abilities that allow them to respond to interpersonal loss and to emerge from the experience changed but not broken. The few studies that have compared responses to different types of losses have found that the loss of a child is followed by a more intense grief than the death of a spouse or a parent. And then over the page, please, Henry, if we under the heading Bereavement, Mourning, Grief and Complicated Grief, we can see a number of concepts there discussed. Bereavement, described as a broad term encompassing the entire experience of family members and friends in the anticipation, death and subsequent adjustment to living following the death of a loved one, widely recognised as a complex and dynamic process that does not necessarily proceed in an orderly linear fashion. And then the top of the next page, please, Henry. Then we have grief described, a term that refers to the more specific complex set of cognitive, emotional and social difficulties that follow the death of a loved one. Individuals vary enormously in the type of grief they experience, its intensity, its duration and their way of expressing it. And then we have mourning defined. Mourning is often defined as either the individual's internal process of adaptation to the loss of a loved one or as the socially prescribed modes of responding to loss, including its external expression in behaviours such as rituals and memorials. And then we see the concept of complicated grief. And it says this: complicated grief in adults refers to bereavement accompanied by symptoms of separation, distress and trauma. And then we see a number of what are called distress symptoms listed: intrusive thoughts about the deceased, yearning for the deceased, searching for the deceased, excessive loneliness since the death, purposelessness about the future, numbness, detachment or absence of emotional responsiveness, difficulty believing or acknowledging the death, feeling that life is empty or meaningless, feeling that part of oneself has died, shattered world view, assuming symptoms of harmful behaviours of the deceased person, excessive irritability, bitterness or anger related to the death. And then we see the observation of the impact upon siblings. Siblings of children who die have also been found to be at greater risk for externalising and internalising problems when compared to norms and controls within 2 years of the death. Now, whether or not a person meets the formal diagnostic criteria for complicated grief, am I right in thinking that what's termed the distress symptoms there listed may encompass the kind of response and feelings that many people will experience when they suffer the death of a child or a partner or someone else who they dearly love?
Yeah, very much so. I think this paper describes it very clearly. I think the other, and we heard lots of witnesses describe exactly these sorts of feelings, both physical, psychological changes following the sense of loss and grief and so on. But I think the really telling thing for me was I went away and looked up in something called DSM, which is a sort of official classification system that's used for classifying people's psychological mental health problems. I looked up complicated bereavement and tried to think of it in relation to what witnesses had told us. And I just think, just listen to this and then think about relating it to our present context. Complicated grief obviously is something that's much more intense, much more prolonged. So it doesn't, grief, bereavement, is quite variable, but this is something that's, much more so. Reasons for it. The bereaved person has trouble accepting the death, so clearly issues around a child dying there. If the individual feels unable to trust others, again, we're going to talk more about trust and about communication. If the individual harbours an excessive bitterness and or anger related to the death, again, thinking about what we talked about yesterday. And other factors associated with complicated grief, it's more common with the loss of a child, as we've said. If the nature of the cause and the circumstances around the death are complex or, sort of beyond the usual. And if the quality of care, palliative care, the sort of support you would normally give to someone who's in that last stage of their life, if that's poor or not available. And if there are concurrent stressors, financial hardships and so on, you think about that list of factors and think about what people have told us in their statements, it's really not surprising to me that a lot of people talked about complicated grief, effectively, grief that's still with them now, because a lot of these issues are still there. And what comes out of that is that people ruminate. These things prey on the mind, and people ruminate about themselves, the anger maybe they felt, the guilt that maybe they felt, and all of those sort of recriminations, if you like, that are linked to that death. So, I think what we have seen and heard from many witnesses really does fall into this, what is a diagnostic category. It's described as a very clear, condition that people can experience.
I'd just like to add to what Professor Weinman just said, and this document is excellent. One of the things when I read it, and from my experience of working with sickle cell patients who are predominantly black, that the cultural variables are so strong when you lose a child. When you lose a child in any culture, and we've all got subcultures anyway within this community, this basically UK community, so-called white community, we have varying subcultures. But with diverse cultures, like African Caribbean cultures, the particular meaning of a child's death takes on tremendous added proportions. And I think sometimes those things are not given credence within the documents that we've looked at, because it's not been researched fully enough. But I'd just like to say that's a really important thing to say, that we, as a population in the UK, is very diverse, and we should think about those factors as well. And in my work, it's a really important element that comes through.
And if we just turn to the next page of this report, there's the observations you've made, Professor Weinman, I think would bear on many of the accounts that we've heard, not simply about the deaths of a child, but about the deaths of partners as well.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And then there's some specific observations here about some particular additional components in relation to a parental loss of a child. And so I'll just pick it up in the first paragraph, 4 lines down. At various stages in the life cycle, men and women relate to child conceiving and child rearing roles as central to their existence. And I think, Dr. Thomas, that bears upon a point you made before the break about those who do not have children and the sense of bereavement for the future that you described. And then it continues, if the bonds formed within the family, the parent-child bond is not only particularly strong, it's also integral to the identity of many parents and children. And then the next paragraph says this, parents of children and adolescents who die are found to suffer a broad range of difficult mental and physical symptoms. As with many losses, depressed feelings are accompanied by intense feelings of sadness, despair, helplessness, loneliness, abandonment, and a wish to die. And of course, again, we've heard that from people talking both about the deaths of children and the deaths of partners and other loved ones. Parents often experience physical symptoms such as insomnia or loss of appetite, as well as confusion, inability to concentrate, obsessive thinking, extreme feelings of vulnerability, anxiety, panic, and hypervigilance can also accompany the sadness and despair. And then the passage goes on to talk in particular about anger. And then the next paragraph, please, Henry. Children take on great symbolic importance in terms of parents' generativity and hope for the future. All parents have dreams about their children's futures. When a child dies, the dreams may die too. This death of future seems integral to the intensity of many parents' responses. 3 central themes in parents' experience when a child dies includes 1, the loss of sense of personal competence and power, 2, the loss of a part of the self, and 3, the loss of a valued other person whose unique characteristics were part of the family system. While guilt and self-blame are common in bereavement, they're especially pronounced following the death of a child. The parent's role competence as the child's caregiver, protector and mentor is severely threatened by untimely death. Yes?
So what I would like to comment on is that this is not just an acute reaction. This is not just something that happens when the child dies. It's not just something that's around 6 months afterwards. These feelings can last for years and years and years and years. And I've worked with parents who lost children 30 years ago who still feel this way. And so it's really important to remember that this doesn't just go away. There's no, neat psychological theory that we all work through our grief and bereavement and suddenly we all wake up and we're not feeling that way anymore. Actually, for many people, it changes subtly. It becomes less immediate, but it's always there.
Yes.
I wonder if we might also talk a little bit about the impact on siblings,
Yes.
Because in any chronic disease situation where the parents, of course, have got a major role in caring for the sick child, siblings can respond in a variety of ways, including a sort of resentment towards the sick child that gets all the attention. But then, perversely, when that child dies, extreme guilt felt because they almost like wished it. And sometimes the parents, I think, and I know this from work with cancer as well as other chronic illnesses, the parents sometimes hyper-invest in the remaining children in strange ways that puts huge pressure on them. You know, these are the ones that are left. I've neglected them perhaps to a certain extent. I now have even greater expectations of them, which is difficult for them sometimes to deliver on. And when we get on to talking about care and support services, I think that grieving siblings with their plethora of issues really need help and support as well.
And one of the other features you've alighted upon in your report in relation to the death of a child is in the context of those parents who were administering blood products to their haemophiliac children, the additional component of guilt, the guilt of I have killed my child. In your report at page 9, and again, perhaps we could have this up on screen, please, Henry. It's EXPG 603. We can see at the top of the page the point I've just referenced. In the first paragraph, last sentence, having talked about the guilt some parents have experienced, you've observed that guilt and self-blame are both potent precursors of depression and both almost certainly contributed to the considerable levels of negative mood and depression described in many witness statements. And then in the next paragraph, if we can just highlight the next paragraph, please, Henry. It says this: the types of social impacts of HIV and or hepatitis C on individuals and families were similar in many ways to those experienced with other chronic conditions where partners have to take on major new responsibilities for the family and the provision of care. However, there were aspects of the witness's situation that markedly increased the severity of the social impacts for both the affected individuals and family members. And then you've gone on to identify some of what you've observed as being particularly acute for the groups of individuals with which the inquiry is concerned. These included the relatively young age at which some individuals contracted these conditions, leading to particularly severe financial difficulties and related problems. There was limited availability of effective treatments for HIV or hepatitis C infections, and newly researched drugs had many unwanted side effects. And then you refer to the virus not being cleared and risks of sexual transmission and vertical transmission. Is it also fair to say that when one's looking at the severity of social impacts for those with whom we're concerned, stigma, discrimination and lack of support, all of which we're going to come on to shortly, are likely to have compounded and exacerbated the ordinarily severe impacts that flow from long-term chronic illness?
That's certainly the case. And I felt in terms of the social impacts, we can see that many of the social impacts are similar for other chronic conditions, but given the number of conditions that people were coping with here, as well as the stigma, the impacts that this group of people experienced were far more severe, and they're more comprehensive. So they would experience nearly all the different types of social impacts that we've been referring to, and to a high degree.
Thank you. But I'm going to come on to stigma next, but before I do so, I just wanted to ask Ms Edwards just to tell us a little about the Haemophilia and HIV Life History project in which you were involved.
So the Haemophilia and HIV Life History Project is an oral history project. Maybe I need to explain that a little bit to some people. So an oral history project is the concept that you would record history by interviewing people who experience that history. And often history is written by bureaucrats, politicians, historians, academics. But an oral history project would be a collection of memories, testimonies from the people who experienced that. And certainly in 2003, a group of us realised, I having worked in the haemophilia unit as well as in HIV for a long time, realised that this story had not been told. It really hadn't. There was very, very little. And we talked briefly yesterday about what research we had looked for around the psychological impacts of HIV, hepatitis C on people with haemophilia. This was particularly haemophilia. And we all agreed that there was very little. This project is not the type of references that we are using here, because these are peer-reviewed journals by academics who've analysed, owned this work. What we did was we were funded by the Heritage Lottery to interview people throughout the country who had haemophilia and HIV. And it was in 2003, and I don't really believe that we could have done it earlier than that, because I think all of the things that we've already been talking about, the grief, the anger, the confusion, the lack of certainty about what was happening in people's lives, I don't think people were in a position where they would have been very able to verbalise some of the things that they were feeling. By 2003, that became a little easier, and certainly that's what they told me. And so we went around the country and we invited people to talk about their experiences. And we did it in what's called a life history method, which isn't about asking questions about HIV and haemophilia. It's asking questions about everything, from grandparents to where you lived, to where you went to school, who was your girlfriend, what did you play with, everything. And so we have a whole life history. So some of these interviews, on the average, were about 4 hours of recording, and some many more. Those interviews were archived in the British Library. They don't belong to me or the team. On the team, there was an oral historian, there was an archivist from the British Library, there was myself, a counsellor, somebody with haemophilia and HIV, Rob, who I think you know. And between us, this was the work we did for those 2 years. And so those 30 interviews, very extensive long life history interviews, were archived in the British Library. What, of course, we realised very soon while we were doing this project was that many people said to us when we asked them about what it was like finding out that you were HIV positive, they would say, "We don't know, ask my mum, I was 2. And of course, the other big area that was missing was the people who had died. We didn't have those stories, and they are a huge story that we were going to be missing out in 2003. And so we did a second project for the next 2 years, between 2005 and 2007. And that project was called HIV in the Family. And that project was interviewing the siblings, the partners, the parents, the mothers, the children of the people who had died over the previous years. There were 34 of those interviews. So altogether, we collected 64 life history interviews. And like I say, they don't belong to me, they don't belong to anybody. They are in the British Library. They have just gone online and been digitised. They were on tapes, the people who remember tapes, C90s. And those tapes have been digitised. There are a number of people in this room who were interviewed for that project and who I've met over the last 2 days. And those have gone online and can now be accessed from your home computer. You can listen to the whole recording. They are also summarised so that areas can be found through the sometimes 4, 5, 6 hour interviews. can I just explain sort of an example of one of these interviews? So, for example, I interviewed somebody who had never ever spoken to a single person about his HIV infection. He was infected as a young man. He actually hadn't told his mother, and he hadn't told his sister, who he was actually very, very close to, but he never told them. The only people who knew about his HIV and hepatitis C diagnosis was his HIV doctor, his haematologist, and myself. I happened to also be his community nurse. And I asked him if he wanted to do this interview, and he agreed that he would, but that he didn't want anybody to hear it. And I ended up having to do 4 interviews, four sessions with him, because he was very unwell. And the last session that I did in this interview was in his hospital bed, matter of days before he died. And he finishes the interview saying, I know I'm going to die. I'm really sorry that I was unable to share what I've been through my life with my sister, who I love, and my mother, who I love. But when I die and at my funeral, I want you to give these tapes to my sister. And that was the first time that she found out how he actually had died. And so it was that was one example. Some of the examples of the interviews that we did were full of laughter and full of resilience, as we talked about yesterday. You know, what comes out is that individuals are very, very diverse. But if anybody wants to hear these interviews, they are accessible. I may want to reiterate it's the British Library, because one person that we interviewed was in an audience like this when I was talking about the project, and he said, where are they kept? And I said, the British Library, mate. And he said, oh no, I've told everybody I'm in the Natural History Museum.
I think it's right that there are a handful of the interviews that are not public, in accordance with the wishes of those who gave the interviews. Yes. And I should also say that the British Library has provided to the inquiry all the materials that it can provide, and they are materials that have been read and listened to by the inquiry and members of the inquiry team.
And I believe you have also got the closed interviews.
We do, I think.
Which is very, very, very unusual to have access to an oral history interview that has been closed.
That, I think, leads very naturally to the next theme I wanted to ask you about, which is the theme of stigma and discrimination. And in your report, you say this on page 20, the impacts of medical conditions for individuals and families are profoundly affected by whether they are imbued by a stigma. And I wanted to ask first about 2 aspects of stigma that are referred to in the report and in the literature: felt stigma and enacted stigma. And could you explain what those 2 concepts mean and what the difference is between them?
Yes. Well, first, just to say the stigma, so we're talking about a condition or behaviour which, in the view of the wider society, marks an individual as unacceptably different and inferior. And with felt stigma, people are aware of the social meanings of their condition. They're aware that they've got a condition that's regarded as unacceptable in the wider society, and this influences their own self-identity. So felt stigma refers to this understanding of their own possession of a condition which is viewed so negatively and obviously affects their identity. And enacted stigma refers to the response of members of the society to people who are identified as possessing a stigmatising condition. And this can take various forms. It can take particularly avoidance of these people, avoidance in different circumstances, socially, at work, and in other settings, and avoidance and exclusion, and often bullying. Children particularly can be subject to bullying. It's very, very painful, and it was reported quite extensively by the witnesses. And in addition, in some people even experience property being vandalised, and a very high level of enacted stigma and fear of enacted stigma, even if you don't actually experience it. The actual fear that you might is in itself very, very powerful and has a major influence on people's lives.
And one of the consequences of stigma may be that individuals do not wish to disclose their condition, and many witnesses reported that either contemporaneously or still today they didn't want to disclose their condition. That leads to two further concepts I wanted to ask you about, and perhaps I can do this by reference to one of the papers in the bundle. Henry, it's EXPG 606, please. It's a paper by Beals and others. If you go to the next page, please. No, sorry, the next one. It's called Stigma Management and Wellbeing. And there were just two parts I wanted to show you and then ask you about. So on that first page, right-hand column, please, picking it up 4 lines down. This particular paper, its focus was sexual orientation, but there are some general concepts. We see there reference to a process of stigma management. And it says this process of stigma management is a major task for individuals with concealable stigmas who weigh the pros and cons of disclosure versus concealment and make decisions based on the circumstances. And then it refers to another paper, Kane, 1991, observed that both options can be taxing because disclosure often entails planning and execution, and concealment requires individuals to attend to many aspects of their social presentation and lifestyle that would ordinarily go unnoticed. And then, Henry, if we could turn on 2 pages. Right-hand column under the heading, the role of suppression. We can see in the first paragraph, it talks about suppression, a feeling people may experience if they conceal personal or emotional information they would like to reveal. And then it refers to another paper, Pennebaker and colleagues showed that suppression can be detrimental to one's psychological and physical well-being. We can leave that now. Thank you, Henry. So I wanted to ask you, if I may, about these two concepts of stigma management and suppression, please.
I can speak from a child-adolescent perspective, so a young person who may have been aware of their condition. Even with conditions which we don't think of as being highly stigmatised, something like diabetes, for example, there are many, many adolescents who live with diabetes who don't tell anybody at school, who keep it an absolute secret at the detriment of their well-being and health. So they won't inject insulin, for example, because they don't want their friends to know. They don't want to feel different. So if you multiply this by 1 million with something like HIV, where there's masses of ignorance and negative presentation, media presentation, and we weren't in the middle of a social media storm then, but even so, on the television, the dreadful adverts and the awful newspaper reports that came out, that it would have been impossible for a young person living with haemophilia and HIV to not be acutely aware of the potential for stigma and to have to both manage that but also suppress it, not to tell people and it's exhausting. That's one of the things in that paper that doesn't say. It talks about what you have to do in order to suppress, but it doesn't. The end of the sentence should be, and it is exhausting, because it is exhausting to constantly be trying to not let people know through what you do or how you do it or what you say or where you go or you don't tell people about hospital appointments, you don't tell people about medication that you're taking, or the fact that you can't go out for an evening because you're exhausted and feeling dreadfully ill, and you have to pretend that you just don't want to go. So you get a reputation as somebody who's not much fun, rather than people realising that you're actually very ill. So I think from an adolescent perspective, again, that's really, really difficult and challenging for a young person who wants to be part of the world, but who has to prevent themselves participating.
Well, I'd like to say something
Yes.
about suppression. Maybe really follow on from what Deborah said. The people who you cite there, Pennebaker, Petrie and so on, are colleagues who I've worked with, and a lot of their work has shown that if you hold on to something you don't disclose, you keep it inside you for long periods of time, the costs, not only emotionally, but the costs physically can be huge. And there's very good work now looking at people who have really aversive memories or things they've never disclosed to other people, trauma, a whole range of different experiences, including illness-related experiences, and that keeping sort of all those memories inside or keeping those experiences inside comes at a big cost. And what's very interesting about James Pennebaker's work is that he, many years ago, found that if he said to people, what I want you to do is write about something that you've never told anybody about, and write your innermost thoughts and feelings, try to contact those. And typically got people to write over a number of days. And for a number of people, the effects on them were profound, initially quite uncomfortable. But what happened was that as they began to write and get something out there, they started to make sense of it a bit, understand it. Because when it's all in your head and you haven't disclosed, you haven't spoken to anybody, it's all at that very emotional, that very deep level, and you're not really making sense of it. So again, that failure of disclosure or lack of disclosure comes at that huge cost. And that we know that disclosure, whether it's written emotional disclosure or spoken disclosure, can be very powerful. And some of Pennebaker's studies and a whole lot of other people's have shown that.
And we've certainly heard from witnesses who've given evidence anonymously because they still have not disclosed information about their health to those who know them, and from witnesses whose close relatives still do not know that they are, for example, HIV positive. And they've talked to the inquiry about how they have lived for decades, living in many respects a lie. The emotional burden of that must be huge.
I think that emotional exhaustion is really interesting because also as a coping strategy, if you like, suppression and concealment have this element of doom to failure about them, especially if somebody does become progressively sicker and externally they can't disguise anymore what perhaps has been happening. And I think, part of the emotional exhaustion that people feel if they can't talk about these things is due to this anxiety that at any moment it could actually all be revealed, and then the expectation is it's going to be even worse. It's a terribly, if you like, tenuous way to actually deal with things that you're scared of.
But in some cases, it is actually worse. In some cultures, we're talking about stigma sort of at a broad level, but I think echoing what Dr. Thomas has said, in certain cultures, the idea of even admitting that you are feeling a little bit low is not appropriate. We have families who will absolutely categorically not allow their children to come and see a psychologist because in that particular culture it's highly stigmatized. If you add on to that cultures where things like HIV and even haemophilia itself have, or any hematological condition, have negative connotations, the fear of telling everybody something because you think something bad is going to happen is actually a true belief, because when you tell people, you will be excluded from society. So it's a really, really difficult balance to get right in terms of disclose or not disclose. It's not simple.
Yeah.
Professor McMorgan.
Yes, I think it's very much influenced by the strength of of stigma, and so the likely social reaction when you do disclose. And for our witnesses were describing situations in which some people disclosed to trusted friends, but in fact found that the enacted stigma was so strong that they were completely cut off and isolated. So I think there are different situations according to the sort of strength of the stigma and so the strength of the social reaction. Because what we're hoping with disclosure is these positive benefits for the individual, and some of these benefits should come from greater social support. But that can be limited.
Can I just add the fact that we talk a lot about HIV stigma, I think further is evidence of the extraordinary stigma of hepatitis C. And we tend to talk about HIV stigma because it is very much in our lives, and because of the health promotion that went round it, the fact that Freddie Mercury died, that Princess Diana held people's hand, that actually the stigma is something we verbalise and talk about. There has been no such thing for hepatitis. And I think that the stigma of that today is huge. And people find it very difficult to verbalise and to talk about that because they don't know what reactions people are going to be, because it's not something that society talks about very much.
Dr. Thomas.
And just picking up on that point around psychological support, and for me, coming out of the documents that I've read was the lack of support that was offered. Some people did get good support, and it was variable across the country. But another barrier to people accessing psychological support is a stigma that's attached to psychological services. And, I remember just in an anecdotal conversation I've had with one of our consultants, and I sort of talked about, the notion that I might sort of extend psychological support in an area. And he said, well, Nicky, I don't want you to do this touchy-feely nonsense with our patients, because actually it's still seen as a woolly concept, providing support for people. So if the establishments out there see it as not an acceptable form of support, it's also another barrier for people to overcome. And I just thought important just to say that at this moment in time.
Can I add one thing to that? With regards to talking about the Life History Project, it's very interesting how many young men said to me it was an enormous step to access support when it was there. Yeah. So I think it's an internal thing as well. And without making huge generalisations, this was young, male patients who'd had haemophilia, now HIV, hepatitis C. And, we talk a lot about did they access psychological support and counselling. For many people, that step was enormous. And we have some very amusing clips of on a website that we made about this, about people saying, I wasn't going to go to Birch Grove and sit around with the chitty-chatty stuff and start talking to people about my feelings. Of course he went, and it was amazing. But the verbalising that idea that it's not manly to access support. It's not only coming from institutional, it's coming from within us.
We're going to look at a couple of HIV and then hepatitis C specific materials in relation to some of the particular aspects of stigma associated with those conditions. But just picking up on what you've said about Birchgrove, could we have up on screen, please, Henry, HSOC 0005046. So this is a report, keeping it in the family, access to information and service provision, findings from a study on behalf of the Birchgrove Group and the Haemophilia Society. And for present purposes, there's one passage I wanted to ask you to note on the next page, please, Henry. It's halfway down the page, beginning, then there is paradox. Fifth paragraph down. You could highlight that in the following paragraph. And could you highlight the second paragraph as well, if possible, Henry? The one after that. Thank you. So this really, in the words of those who were living with the condition and with the dilemmas, encapsulates some of what you've described, I think. Then there is paradox. In the first and probably second phase of the epidemic in the UK, and this is talking about the HIV/AIDS epidemic, raising the profile was seen to be the way to connect disease with human beings, to reduce the stigma and discrimination. People came out to raise the profile. If the stigma and discrimination associated with HIV are not challenged, prevention won't work, people will not come forward for testing, and the move will be to drive it underground with all that means. So those living with HIV have had to manage something of a dilemma, to come out and perhaps experience profound discrimination, or to remain closeted about their HIV status, and thus perpetuate the view that, quote, it doesn't exist, it's the province of queers and junkies, close quote. And if they do have it, they should stay outside the norms of the rest of society, including the right to have children. Confidentiality or coming out, challenging social attitudes against the discrimination and stigma associated with HIV infection, or protecting the individual's right to privacy. So that captures the dilemma for many. In terms specifically of, first of all, of the stigma associated with HIV and AIDS, I just wanted to, again, put up one of the materials that you've referenced in your report on the screen, and just look briefly at the 1980s and then come forward to present day. Henry, it's EXPG 5033, please. This is a paper about heroin, it says it in the title, Heroin Injecting and the Introduction of HIV/AIDS into a Scottish City. There's just one passage on the page 3, please, Henry, at the bottom right-hand corner of the page. It's the last paragraph on the right-hand side, please. And this refers to the advertising campaigns of the 1980s. It was in 1987 that the famous UK campaigns were launched, involving TV adverts which showed the tip of the iceberg and tombstone images. Leaflets delivered to every household proclaimed AIDS, don't die of ignorance, anyone can get it, gay or straight, male or female, already 30,000 people are infected. The major influence on this was the fear that the infection would spread into the heterosexual community as a result of sexual contact with drug users. There was much less regard for the hapless human beings who were already infected. There was little information about what might happen to them, and estimates of illness and mortality were guesstimates based on widely differing reports from around the world. Do you know if there's been any research or study about the impact of those public health campaigns in the second half of the 1980s?
Very effective.
I don't know of any direct evidence of that, but I mean, certainly the witnesses referred to these campaigns as having the effect of increasing general fear and stigma. The campaigns were obviously trying to change behaviours, but by emphasising that HIV was something anybody could get and so on, and knowing about the high death rates, this really increased the fear, which stoked the stigma. So it was an unintended sort of consequence, really.
In fact, much of the research that has been done looking at public health campaigns sort of does demonstrate that very often they are ill-informed, rarely actually do influence behaviour because they don't come from, by and large, any theoretical underpinnings that we know about, and then they sort of die a natural death without people really looking and thinking, well, how did smoking get reduced, or have we actually tackled the obesity crisis in a sensible way? And this campaign in particular, the only research I am aware of is the fact that it really portrayed exactly the wrong messages if you wanted to get behavioural change. Fear rarely works in terms of changing behaviours.
And in your report at page 20, you've observed that the campaigns contributed to widespread public fear and to the popular notion that HIV/AIDS could be caught through normal social interaction. Now, you've observed in your report from the statements and the evidence that the inquiry has heard a number of examples of enacted stigma, really quite severe examples of enacted stigma. I don't know whether you can answer this, but are there any kind of steps or response that you think could or should have been taken in the 1980s and 1990s, specifically dealing with this, what was called the HIV or AIDS epidemic, that might have reduced the stigma associated with the condition or mitigated its effects?
I don't know if
I guess one of the problems was that people were starting from a rather uneducated basis anyway in interpreting what was seen to be happening. So you had a dual problem, really, of the people who were trying to launch campaigns and provide information didn't actually always have it, or did it in a rather cack-handed fashion. And that just created a sense of further panic amongst the sort of general population.
I also think that we didn't have the psychological knowledge that we have now about nudge and behaviour change. So the ideas that we have now about getting people to eat differently, shop differently, behave differently, those campaigns are underpinned by very different psychological theories. And as Lesley said, fear was, the smoking, the anti-smoking. I mean, the anti-smoking campaigns didn't work. They didn't reduce people smoking. A few people maybe, but the majority of people don't change their behaviour because you tell them not to. It just if we yell at somebody and say cut the grass or paint the spare bedroom or tidy your room, the response is not now. I'm busy. I don't want to, I'm not doing anything you tell me to do. And that whole governmental kind of, I'm going to wag my finger at you and tell you not to do it, was how we used to think that we could educate and control public behaviour. But we know that it doesn't work now. So educational campaigns now are much cleverer. They're about motivating people to feel that they have the capacity to change their behaviour. And the campaigns in the 80s and 90s just didn't do that. They just didn't have that ability. And as everybody has said here, what they did was they created more fear, that people that did that were bad. I don't do it, I'm good. So those that do are bad. And it created that polarity between good people and bad people.
I think the other thing with this campaign, it did actually massively increase people going for testing who were not at risk of HIV at all. There was a huge amount of testing was undertaken in the hospitals in those early days for people's fear, who, despite the fact that these leaflets, if you remember the leaflet that went around to everybody's house, as well as the television adverts, actually did have a lot of information on them. Whether people read that and actually heard what they were reading and is another matter, because as said, fear came up and everybody rushed off to be tested. I think the thing that was particularly difficult about this is watching these adverts and reading these leaflets when you were already infected. And I think, what Roy Robertson says then about the guys in Edinburgh, and whether it was them or it was here, it was gay men, it was people with haemophilia. If you had HIV, you were seeing this, everybody's going to die, there is no help, which is such a distressing message to have. It was obviously to educate the public who were uninfected, but the impact it had on people who were already infected and unwell was enormous.
Yes, Professor Morgan.
So that in some cases we find that sort of media celebrities can be very important in actually challenging stigma. And if you think about it, the late Princess Diana actually shaking hands with somebody with AIDS. I mean, that seemed to be more important to people in thinking about these issues and recognising that you couldn't just contract AIDS so easily, rather than just endless sort of printed word and so on. So I think that we have to think in different ways of communicating to actually challenge the
Mark
stigma.
Fowler on EastEnders.
Yeah.
Remember? Great job.
Many of the most severe descriptions of enacted stigma in the witness statements describe events in the 1980s and in the 1990s. But bringing matters forward to the 21st century, you've referenced in your report some papers which describe the ongoing stigma and discrimination, first of all, in relation to HIV. I'm going to take you to one of them, but I'm going to ask you first to note you've referred to a paper which looked at discrimination, HIV-related discrimination in 2004-2005. For anyone who wants, sitting behind me who wants a note of it, it's EXPG 00000014. You don't need to put it up on screen, Henry. But that was a survey in London. One of the authors of it is Professor Anderson, who'll be coming on Thursday to talk about HIV, so we may be able to ask her about it. Nearly a third of respondents in 2004-2005 reported HIV-related discrimination. Almost half of those reported some form of discrimination in the healthcare sphere, and I'll come on to that in a moment. But bringing it on then 10 years further on to 2015, you've referred in your report to the HIV stigma survey, and we will put that on screen, please. Henry, it's EXPG 5027, please. So we can see it's Stigma Survey UK 2015, and it's titled HIV in the UK, Changes and Challenges, Actions and Answers, the People Living with HIV Stigma Survey. So this is only 4 or 5 years ago, and we only need to look at a couple of passages. If we go to the next page, please, Henry, we can see it says this. The landscape for people living with HIV in the United Kingdom is dramatically different from what it was 10 or 20 years ago. Advances in treatment mean the life expectancy of HIV-positive people can be the same as that of the general population. Living with HIV in the age of undetectability and reduced risk of transmission should mean a better quality of life for people living with HIV. However, despite some shifts in public attitudes, a considerable number of people in the UK still hold stigmatising attitudes towards people living with HIV. Consequently, stigma remains a significant obstacle for many people living well with diagnosed HIV. And then if we just have the next page, please, Henry, and we need to look only at the summary of the findings, I think, rather than the detail of the report. In 2015, people living with HIV in the United Kingdom continue to feel stigmatised and experience HIV-related discrimination. The survey findings show that while 2/3 of 1,576 participants felt overall positive about their life and in control of their health, in the past year, around half reported feeling shame, guilt or self-blame in relation to their HIV status, and 1 in 5 had felt suicidal. And then the report observes those feelings are more likely to affect those who are recently diagnosed. And then if we go 2 paragraphs further down, experiences of stigma in the healthcare setting were common, and 1 in 8 participants had avoided seeking care in the past year. Similarly, about 1 in 8 people had decided not to apply for or turn down employment or a promotion due to their HIV status. And then the last paragraph in that section, a considerable number of participants had sought support in the last 12 months, including from a local HIV support organisation. Participants believe that education and awareness campaigns are necessary to challenge the stigma and discrimination experienced by people living with HIV in the UK today. So this is not a phenomenon of the past. Can I ask you in particular to comment upon the suggestion there about the continuing need for education and public awareness campaigns, please?
I mean, I'll start. I'm sure other members of the panel will add on to this. There's something about how conditions are perceived as being your fault. So if in the world of eating disorders, for example, working with people who are overweight, there's enormous stigma, because generally people think that people who are overweight are lazy and it's their fault that they're fat. It's their fault, they've done it to themselves, and that they haven't tried to do anything to stop it. Whereas at the other end, if you look at somebody who's living with anorexia nervosa, there's this enormous outpouring of sorrow and distress and feeling of sympathy for this person who is ill, and therefore, and it's not their fault they're ill, it's because they have a mental illness, an eating disorder. And the same is true for HIV, this feeling of blame, that on the whole, the population, the public, feel that it's something that you have done to yourself, or somebody, in the case of sort of if you were a child, and because of the medication nowadays, children aren't born with HIV, but when children were being born with HIV, it was their mother had done something, and so they came from a bad family. And again, there's this use of the word bad and good. So I think with nowadays, I think we still have that concept of blame. If you've got something that everybody thinks is your fault because there's not enough education to demonstrate that you can't help it, it's nothing that you've done to yourself, then people kind of disrespect you, or there's going to be that worry about stigma and the impact of stigma. So that's how I would start.
I think also we ought to mention actually the role of religion here and different cultures, because for some it is seen as divine retribution for your, misdemeanours. And that, of course, in certain parts of the world, like South Africa, for example, led to a huge explosion of HIV, even when, in fact, most of the rest of the world were able to contain it and treat it, because of a sort of perception by a lot of people over there that either it didn't exist, which was just plain ignorance, or that if people did get it, it was due to their, sort of failure to follow the rules of the good book.
Professor Morgan.
Yes. So I think you've mentioned one aspect underlying it, which is the blame. But I think a second aspect is the fear, and there is still fear. And I think this is something that needs to be addressed, because the notion of fear is sort of amplified. And once you fear that HIV could be more easily contracted than it is, and so on, there is bound to be barriers and discrimination. So I think it's both. It's the issues of blame and issues of fear.
Thank you. So I note the time. I'm going to move on to stigma and hepatitis C, but we can do that after lunch.
Well, let's do that after lunch, and we'll take a break now until 2 o'clock. So 2 o'clock, please.